Dear President, caro Mario, Director, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud to be at the Bocconi University today to inaugurate your academic year. For over a century, this university has remained true to its founding values of being a major research university with democratic values, engaged in Europe and open to the world. But today is also a very special day for Europe. On December 9, 1989, 20 years ago, I was in Brussels, serving as Chief of Staff to the President of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, and every 5 minutes I was receiving on my desk news wires describing how the border guards were coping with the masses that started to gather at the Berlin Wall. And then we saw the big news. The wall had fallen. The guards, who 2 hours earlier would have shot at their brothers, were now letting the crowd through. Jacques Delors, and I remember that very well, because I attended this phone conversation, called Chancellor Kohl and found him as surprised as we all were. So we knew then that history was calling. We were at the start of a new era, one which was predicted to be stable, peaceful, what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. And the fall of the Berlin Wall was indeed a turning point in globalization. The end of the Cold War opened an unprecedented era of economic openness. We saw a reduction in poverty like never before. Freedom expanded, and with it, ideas, culture, technology. And yet, 20 years later, the world is in a state of serious distress. We are in the midst of the worst ever economic crisis and the first to have such a global reach. A crisis which has seen a decimation of employment. We are seeing our planet deteriorate due to global warming, with severe droughts, violent floods, with entire islands disappearing underwater, with nuclear proliferation, which poses a serious threat to world peace and security. So, what went wrong? The reality, in my view, is that the end of the Cold War took everyone by surprise. It was the end of a bipolar world. A new world order was being born, but there was not enough thinking and discussion about what this new order would look like, about its governance structures. There was never a Bretton Woods or a San Francisco conference before or after 1989. And as a result, global governance structures did not adjust. And here lies, in my view, the root of many of today's problems. Global challenges need global solutions, and this can only come with the right global governance, which today, 20 years later, remains too weak. And yet there is a place on Earth where new forms of global governance have been tried following World War II, here in Europe. More than half a century ago, Jean Monnet said, and I quote him, "The sovereign nations of the past can no longer provide a framework for the resolution of our present problems. And the European community itself is no more than a step towards the organizational forms of tomorrow's world." End of quote. And I think this is as valid now as it was then. Now, what do I mean by global governance? For me, global governance describes the system we set up to assist human society to achieve its common purpose in a sustainable manner, that is, with equity and justice. Growing interdependence requires that our laws, our social norms, our values, our mechanisms for framing human behavior be examined, debated, understood, and operated together as much as possible. This is what would provide the basis for effective sustainable development in its economic, social, and environmental dimensions. Whether public or private, governance needs to first provide leadership, the incarnation of a vision, of political energy, of drive. It also needs to provide legitimacy, which is essential to ensure ownership over decisions which lead to change, ownership to prevent the built-in bias towards resistance to modify any status quo. A legitimate governance system must also ensure efficiency. It must bring about results to the benefit of the people. And finally, a governance system must be coherent. Compromises have to be found over objectives which may contradict one another. It cannot be about the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing, or even worse, it cannot be about knowingly moving them in different directions. So, leadership, legitimacy, efficiency, coherence are the four basic components of governance as I see it. But of course, as with any system of power within the nation state, what is needed is not only governance, not only global governance, but good global governance. And good global governance is a system which offers the right balance between leadership, efficiency, legitimacy, and which ensures coherence. Now, if that is true, and I believe it's true, what then are the specific challenges of global governance? The first challenge stems from the difficulty of identifying leadership. Internationally, who is the leader? Should it be a superpower? Should it be a gathering of national leaders selected by whom? Should it be an international organization? Now, as to legitimacy, classical legitimacy entails citizens choosing their representatives collectively by voting for them. But it also relies on the political capacity of the system to bring forward public discourse and proposals that produce coherent majorities and provide citizens with a feeling that they are participating in a debate. And since legitimacy depends on the closeness of the relationship between the citizen and the decision-making process, the challenge of global governance is distance. The other legitimacy challenges are the so-called democratic deficit or accountability deficit, which arise when there are no means for individuals to challenge international decision-making. In sum, the specific challenge of global governance is to deal with this perceived, too distant, non-accountable, and non-directly challengeable decision-making at the international level. As with legitimacy, coherence is also proper to the nation-state, and it is transferred to specialized international organizations whose mandates are limited. Now, in theory, there should be no problem. The coherent action by the nation-state in the various remits of international governance would be translated into a coherent global action. But we all know that this theory do not match with reality. We all know that nation-states also have the monopoly of incoherence. In practice, they often act incoherently, and here lies the third challenge of global governance: how to deal with partial and incoherent efficiency. And finally, remoteness of power and multiple levels of government pose a specific challenge for efficiency. Nation-states resist more or less intensely, largely dependent on the state and on the topic. They resist intensely transferring or sharing jurisdiction over certain matters within international institutions. And the national diplomatic systems often do not reward international cooperation. As I have said on numerous occasions, I know of no diplomat having been fired for saying no, whereas I know of some who've been fired for having said yes. Handling global problems using traditional democratic models has, as we've just seen, important limitations. And yet, the very credibility of domestic democracies is at risk if global governance does not find its own democratic credentials, if citizens feel that the issues which affect them daily cannot be adequately dealt with. Now, turning now to Europe, in these troubled times for the European Union, it's no easy matter to present it as a new paradigm of global governance. But I remain of the view that the European construction is the most ambitious experiment today in international governance. It is the story of a desired, defined, organized interdependence between its member states, and it is therefore worth looking at how Europe has coped with the challenges I just described. My starting point is that the building of Europe has work in progress. It is not complete in any of its dimensions, not in that of geography, not in its depth, that is, the powers conferred by its member states to the EU, and certainly not in the sense of identity that provides the glue which holds any human society together. My second warning is that the European paradigm is specific to the conditions of temperature and pressure prevailing in the European continent. A continent which was ravaged by 2 world wars, which left millions dead and many more millions of men and women in search of peace, stability, and prosperity. And I would therefore recommend caution when trying to ascribe universal value to what is only today one part of our world, and indeed other paradigms are also emerging around the world which reflect their own specific conditions. But true, the creation of the European coal and steel community in the 50s was the result of the political will to move beyond these 2 world wars. This political will was to see peace take root in what Robert Schuman called de facto solidarities. And the men and women at that time embodied this in a concrete project, combining the 2 essential pillars of the economies of the time, coal and steel, to the will and to the concrete objective. They added a third element, the creation of a sui generis, new supranational institution, the high authority of the European Steel and Coal Community. Now, at the heart of this initial venture was the essence of the European project, the creation of a federal space where decisions can be taken which are directly applicable and enforceable by and on the member states, a space of pooled sovereignty, a space within which its members agree to govern life among themselves without having to permanently recourse to international treaties. What marks the essence of the European governance paradigm is this coming together of a will, a goal to be attained, as well as an institutional setup. And it is the combination of the 3 elements and not the specific method of governance. Not that we should underestimate the sort of technological leap forward in the building of Europe. The fact that community law has precedence over national laws. The creation of a supranational body such as the European Commission that has been given the monopoly of initiating legislation. A European Court of Justice where decisions are binding on national courts. A parliament composed of a Senate of member states and a House of Representatives elected by the European people and which has gained in competence over the years. Now, these are just a few of the things that, taken together, make the European Union a radically new economic and political entity on the scene of international governance. But this unprecedented creation could not be the products of those innovations alone. Indispensable, indisputable though they are, those institutional innovations are still inseparable from the conditions from which they emerged, and it is agreement on substance that leads or permits agreement on the form. Now, how does this European paradigm score on the four components of governance and I mentioned earlier? I believe European governance can fare well on leadership. And I will use two examples to illustrate this. The first one is the campaign for the creation of the internal market in 1992, first launched by Jacques Delors in 1985. A strong political will emerging after a difficult economic and political period. A clear objective of erasing internal barriers to the movement of goods, capital, people, and a major institutional reform that led to the acceptance of majority voting instead of unanimity for the adoption of decisions leading to the creation of the internal market. The second example is the creation of the euro. True, it took over 20 years to gather the necessary political will, to define the objective, to be followed by the creation of the ECB, the European Central Bank, possibly the most federal of all European institutions. But I said governance, European governance can fare well on leadership. There has also been less successful manifestations of leadership. Take the example of the Lisbon Agenda, where there has been a conspicuous absence of political will and only half-shared objectives. I also believe that Europe scores positively on the second component, which is coherence. Institutionally, the fact that the European Commission acts on the principle of collegiality and has the monopoly of initiating legislation on most areas under community competence, the growing powers of the European Parliament are good drivers of greater coherence. And the reinforcement of community competences, including through the Lisbon Treaty, is, in my view, also a good catalyst for greater coherence. But, as in all federal systems, the frontiers between the national and the federal often remain unclear, with the consequent scope for incoherence. Suffice it to look at areas such as macroeconomic coordination, budgetary matters, energy, or transport. Now, moving to the third element, effectiveness, I also believe that Europe scores rather highly. The role of the European Court of Justice in ensuring respect for the rule of law, the extension of majority voting for decision-making, the capacity with which the European Commission has been entrusted to police compliance with European rules have all been good drivers of European governance effectiveness. So, okay for the first three. But if there is an area where Europe would get B minus, it's probably on the fourth component, which is legitimacy. We are witnessing a growing distance between European public opinion and the European project. One could have expected that the European institutional setup with growing powers entrusted to the European Parliament would have resulted in greater legitimacy. This was indeed the idea behind the direct election of the European Parliament, but this wish, this hope, is obviously contradicted by the declining numbers in participation in elections to the European Parliament. In theory, there is no democratic deficit, but in practice, we witness what Elie Barnaby has called frigid Europe. In spite of constantly striking institutional flints over the past 50 years, there has been no resulting democratic spark. My own interpretation of this failure is that the anthropological dimension of supranationality has probably been underestimated. So we've listened to lawyers, we've listened to political scientists, we've sometimes listened to economists, but we never really asked anthropologists, sociologists to tell us what was at stake. And once the imminence of the menace of a new war has disappeared from our horizon, it is as if the glue that holds Europe together as a community will also disappear. As if there were no common myths, no common dreams, no common nightmares, and no common aspirations. So, as I already said, the European experience tells us that three ingredients are needed for a successful integration process. First, the political will to act together. Second, a common, well-identified project. And third, an institutional machinery to make it work. And looking at the areas where European integration has scored above average, I would argue that these should include, as I already said, the construction of the internal market, the European Monetary Union, and trade policy. And the fact that Europe is now a vast union of 27 member states, of around 500 million citizens, representing over 1/4 of world trade, accounting for the world's largest GDP, and speaking through one mouth with one voice, gives Europe the capacity to defend its vision of international trade opening accompanied by rules. If we take the example of the environment, Europe has had a leadership role in the world, which is a reflection of the large consensus existing within European public opinion on the protection and preservation of the environment, and yet the institutional setup within which Europe acts, the sort of mixed competences, different voices, prevent, in my view, Europe from fully displaying its effectiveness in this area. So let's say this is an area where Europe breaks even. There are, however, two areas where Europe, in my view, is not punching its weight. On development, the EU is the world's largest aid donor. The European flag can be seen at almost every major humanitarian crisis. This is backed by strong citizen support. In a Eurobarometer poll published just a month ago, 72% of Europeans are in favor of honoring or even going beyond existing aid commitments to the developing world. So this means that despite the sharp economic downturn, public support for the European motto, keeping our promises, is real. And yet, I believe that Europe has so far had a limited influence in the setting of world development policy. The second is, of course, the common foreign and security policy. The good news is that European citizens demand more and better from Europe in foreign policy, but there we touch upon an issue where symbolic barriers, those of the dreams, the nightmares I was mentioning, those of collective identities and myths remain powerful. And this is why I believe that building a European foreign and security policy will require a long process of looking, discussing, finding this permanent compromise which foreign policy is between interests and values. I think the creation of the High Representative of the Union for Foreign and Security Policy, who also will be the Vice President of the Commission and who also will chair the General Affairs Council, is a step in the right direction, but it will also take a serious common effort to act together and a common concept, a sort of shared project to get there. Now, there are a number of lessons that we can draw from more than 60 years of European integration. The lessons for global governance of the European experience. The first lesson, in my view, is that institutions alone cannot do the trick. Neither can political will without a clearly defined common project. Nor can a well-thought-through common project deliver results if there is no institutional machinery. So the reality is that we need the three elements together to create an integration dynamic. But even if these three elements are there, there still remains a risk that a real or perceived legitimacy problem remains, creating a sort of glass ceiling for further integration, which may be where EU is today. The reality is that supranational institutions, and the European Union is one, require a long-term investment. And this is often incompatible with the short-term attention span of many of its leaders who are often elected on thin majorities or with fragile coalitions, Italy, as we all know, being an exception. Global legitimacy requires long-term care and attention. So, to go back to the lessons, I have often likened governance system to the three states of mass. The national level, which in my view represents the solid state, the international system, which in my view is more like gaseous, and in between lies the European integration process in a kind of liquid state. Now, whichever the state of mass, what is required to have a governance system work is this precise combination of political will, capacity to decide, and accountability. And then, let me, before I conclude, focus a bit on the general lessons. First lesson is about the importance of the rule of law and that of enforceable commitments. Global governance must be anchored in commitments adopted by stakeholders in rules, in regulations, with mechanisms which foster and promote their respect. This is at the heart of the multilateral trading system, with its more than 60 years of regulating trade among nations and with its binding dispute settlement as a means to ensure compliance with these rules. This is also at the heart of what the international community is trying to do on climate change, a multilateral deal where nations commit to greenhouse gases emissions reductions accompanied by measures to facilitate adaptation, mitigation. And this is also, for instance, what the international community is trying to achieve on the ongoing negotiations on non-proliferation. So, commitments which are anchored in a multilateral context, which can be monitored, which can be subject to dispute settlements, do foster efficiency and greater coherence. The second final lesson I would draw for global governance is that of respect for the principle of subsidiarity. It is about performing functions at the level where these are more effectively carried. And on this, I can do no better than a quote from the last encyclical letter of Pope Benedict XVI, Caritas in Verite, when he argues, and I quote, that the governance of globalization must be marked by subsidiarity, articulated into several layers and involving different levels that can work together. Globalization certainly requires authority, insofar as it poses the problem of global common good that needs to be pursued. This authority, however, must be organized in a subsidiary and stratified way if it is not to infringe upon freedom and if it is to yield effective results in practice. End of quote. The international system should not be overburdened with issues which are better dealt with at the local, regional, or national level. Third lesson is that coherence starts at home. Coherence lies first and foremost with the members of international organizations. Take the United Nations. Of course, we can and must have a UN delivering as well. And we've been working years and years and years on this. But we also have to see the UN members behaving as one in the different organizations which make up the family of the United Nations. And hence, the final lesson, which is in my view that since the political demos remains essentially national, legitimacy of any global governance system would be greatly enhanced if international issues become part of the domestic political debate. If national governments are held accountable for their behavior at the international level by their domestic political systems. The exercise of democracy at the national level needs to integrate an international dimensions to foster legitimacy at the global level. And the fact that the governments which represent states at international organizations are the results of citizens' choices through domestic elections is in itself not sufficient to ensure the legitimacy of international organizations. The fact that in an organization like the World Trade Organization, decisions are taken by consensus, and where each country has one vote, which is theory of democracy, may not be enough to create a sense of legitimacy in the actions of the organization. So more on this is required. National actors, political parties, civil society, parliaments, citizens need to ensure that issues which are part of the global level are discussed at the local, domestic level. Now, the good news is that many of these issues are already work in progress, and that therefore we need not expect a big bang. The global economic crisis we are witnessing has accelerated the move towards a sort of new architecture of global governance, which I have already called a triangle of coherence. On the one side of the triangle lies the G20, replacing the former G8, providing political leadership, policy direction. On another side lie member-driven international organizations providing expertise, specialized inputs, be they rules, policies, or programs. The third side of the triangle is the G192, the United Nations, providing a forum for accountability. In the long term, we should have both the G20 and the international agencies reporting to the Parliament of the UN, and in this respect, a revamping of the UN Economic and Social Council could lend support to this recent resolution, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly on a UN system-wide coherence. This articulation would provide a potent mix of leadership, inclusiveness, action to ensure more coherent, more effective, more legitimate global governance. And with time, the G20 could even be a response to this problem of the reform of the UN Security Council. But a structure, a triangle, a pyramid of this type needs to be underpinned by a set of core principles and values. And this is precisely what the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, has proposed with her suggestion of creation of a charter for sustainable economic activity. This is, in my view, a commendable effort to provide a new global economic contract to anchor economic globalization on the bedrock of ethical principles and values, which would renew the trust that citizens need to have that globalization can indeed work for them. And coming back to my starting point, it is a signal of our times that this initiative comes from Berlin, Germany, today this reunited country at the heart of Europe. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me now conclude. I believe that globalization is today posing a serious challenge for our democracies. Our governance systems must respond to this challenge. If our citizens feel that the global problems are insoluble, if they feel they are out of reach, this will emasculate our democracies. And the same will be true if our citizens see that global problems can be addressed, but that they have no influence on the result. So today, more than ever, our governance systems, whether in Europe or at the global level, must provide citizens with avenues for shaping tomorrow's world, the one they want, their children, their grandchildren to inherit. And among the many regional integration attempts, the European Union remains the laboratory of international governance, the place where the new technological frontier of international governance is being tested, and this test is in your hands. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a fruitful academic year.